Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, welcome to the Lions Roar podcast, brought to you by Lions Roar, a nonprofit media organization offering Buddhist wisdom and guidance for mindful living to benefit our lives and create a more caring and just world. For more, go to lionsroar.com, and if you enjoy this episode, subscribe so you don't miss future ones. In this interview, Buddhadharma Deputy Editor Mariana Restrepo speaks with Dr. Pierce Salguero about a survey he conducted which highlights the growing intersection between academic research and Buddhist practice, and reveals that many Buddhist studies scholars are actively engaged in religious and spiritual practices, with some attributing their academic paths to profound mystical or spiritual experiences.
Welcome, I'm Mariana Restrepo, Deputy Editor of Buddhadharma. I am joined here today by Dr. Pierce Salguero, a multidisciplinary scholar whose work focuses on the historical and contemporary intersections between Buddhism, medicine, and cross-cultural exchange. A major theme in his scholarship is discovering the role of Buddhism in the global transmission and local reception of knowledge about health, disease, and the body. Dr. Salguero is Professor of Asian History and Health Humanities and Program Chair of Multidisciplinary Studies and Health Humanities at Abington College of Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Salguero, welcome, and thank you for speaking with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. So today we'll be discussing a recent survey that you conducted with one of your graduate students, Emily Lang. And this was a survey amongst Buddhist studies scholars and academics. And you guys named this The Secret Lives of Buddhist Studies Scholars. So can you give us a little brief overview on the survey and what it entailed?
Yeah, sure. The Secret Lives of Buddhist Studies Scholars was a little bit of like like a eye-catching title for the article, but the secret that we're referring to with the title is the fact that most scholars of religion in working in the academy, in at least in Western countries, are typically presenting themselves as objective observers of the tradition, and they speak from a more detached and impersonal perspective, and they don't really ever talk about their own religious experiences or religious lives. These days it is fairly common that you have practitioners of Buddhism that are they're monastics, or else they have been forthcoming about the fact that they are Buddhists, but they really don't talk about their own personal experiences or their personal engagement with Buddhism. And so what we were really wanting to investigate was what's going on behind the scenes, with people's engagement in Buddhist activities, and also what kinds of experiences have they had doing those kinds of activities. And so we asked some questions, trying to peek behind the curtain a little bit, and we had some pretty interesting findings.
And so why were you guys interested in this kind of information? And why did you know whether scholars of religion were also practitioners or not?
Yeah, so I have a line of research that I'm involved in, which is looking into spiritual experiences, both positive and negative kinds of experiences that people report from the practice of Buddhist meditation and other kinds of spiritual practices. And so this was sort of like that's my larger research area at the moment, and this was kind of a small research question that was related to that was a good bite-sized research project for a student to do for a one-year undergraduate research project. So I sort of thought of this as a opportunity for a student to do some research related to what I'm interested in, I already have access to the social networks of professors because I'm involved in various Facebook groups and other kinds of online environments where I thought I could relatively easily gather up a bunch of scholars to answer a survey. So it was more because the questions sort of fit with the teaching needs for my student.
Now that you mentioned, kind of that kind of relationships you had and the access to this, respondents. So who were the respondents of the survey?
So we initially conceived of the survey as involving religious studies scholars more generally. And then so the student and I designed the survey, and then I circulated the announcement in these Facebook groups and other online in places where professors of religious studies meet. And as it turns out, I suspected it would be the case, but we cast the net very widely, and as it turned out, but almost everybody that answered the survey was a scholar of Asian religions, and then the Buddhist studies scholars were by far the largest contingent among those. And so in the end, for the little article that we wrote to sort of report on the results of the study, we wound up just focusing on the Buddhist studies scholars themselves because it was such a large percentage of the overall. We sort of just like removed the smaller. I can't remember off the top of my head how many it was, but it was less than 20% that we just kind of like moved off, so we could focus on the Buddhist respondents.
Was there any, anything in, that kind of jumped out at you about the demographics in specific of who the respondents were?
Yeah, I think we did ask a series of demographic questions, and the demographic questions weren't super surprising just to me based on my engagement with the field. Like I know my colleagues, I've been meeting with them in conferences and following their work, and I know them personally, and so I sort of already had a kind of a sense of what the field looks like, and there wasn't anything super surprising in the demography. Just looking at the numbers, it was we had 53% male. There was 60% white. A 22% Asian, Pacific Islander, mostly Asian in that category. And then just also to mention is that about 60% of the respondents were located in the U.S. So it was an international survey, but it is more heavily skewed towards the U.S.
And I remember seeing your post about the survey and like the invitation to fill it out, and I remember I clicked on it actually. And one of the things that I remember was like, kind of one of the questions to go forward with whether you were kind of like had higher than a PhD degree or higher. So you guys weren't really accounting for graduate students. And this is just kind of me wondering about whether kind of like an upcoming scholars might have responded to that differently than, already established, scholars and professors in the field. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Might be interesting to kind of maybe do a follow-up one and see how the new kind of generation of scholars and academics differs.
Yeah, so we did want to limit it to like what I would call active scholars in the field. So the screening question was, do you have a PhD or are you at ABD status, which is the status of a graduate student who is in the last couple of years finishing up their dissertation and about to go on the job market. So that was one screening question, and then the other screening question was or are you actively teaching at a institution of higher education in the field of religious studies, right? So we wanted people who were not somebody who earned a PhD and then never actually was active in the field, or somebody who didn't have the PhD and wasn't a professional scholar of religious studies. So yeah, so it was kind of like a little bit of a narrow bracket to focus on the people who are actively in the field, at institutions of higher education in this profession.
And so the survey did reveal that many scholars are highly engaged in religious and spiritual activities. Were you surprised by this finding or not, and why?
I was, because as I said, this topic is something that is very rarely discussed in public among scholars. Like I said, there's some scholars who are, themselves, monastic, or they're known to be Buddhist, but they don't really speak, in professional settings about their engagement with religion, or their experiences with religion. So, yeah, just looking at the numbers, it was that 58% of the respondents said that they practice religion weekly or more. And so by that category, we included everything from prayer, meditation, ritual practices, or like attending religious services, going to the temples, whatever. So that was, over half, well over half of the respondents doing that on a weekly basis was surprising to me. But what was super surprising to me is that 2/3, so 65% of the respondents reported that they had some kind of religious or spiritual or mystical or awakening experience. And then a lot of them went on to say that was instrumental. So again, over half of the respondents said that experience was influential in their going into the field of religious studies, and 30% of them said it was instrumental in their decision to do that. So that just gave a picture of a whole different side to the field than what I was expecting, from people who present themselves as being, sort of critics and analysts of religion, to find out that 2/3 of them had these kinds of experiences, and that over half of them, that's the reason they got into the field, or one of the main reasons. That was really interesting.
And that's interesting, because I mean, my initial guess would be that they got into the field and then maybe, kind of started studying these traditions and then got into practice. But it seems like it's the other way around. Like they first were practicing, had some kind of experience, and then went into the field as academics. So yeah, that's surprising to me.
Yeah.
Can you share, maybe any of the experiences that kind of come out to you, or that were particularly, I don't know, call to your attention, of the things that they describe?
Yeah. So this being sort of like a bite-sized research project, we didn't necessarily develop a whole new methodology for doing this. What we did was borrow an existing methodology. There's a scale called the Brief Mysticism Scale. It's kind of like a stripped down, simplified version of a questionnaire that elicits responses from the research subjects, talking about the kinds, or putting their experiences into these different categories. And so the most prevalent categories that people responded to saying that they had these kinds of experiences were, so the most prevalent one says, so this is about mystical, religious, or spiritual or awakening experiences. So the most common one was, that they'd had some kind of experience that couldn't be expressed in words. Equally common was, I've had experience in which a new view of reality was revealed to me. And then also right up there with that was, had an experience which was both timeless and spaceless. And then also prevalent was I had an experience I knew to be sacred, and I had an experience where I realized the oneness of myself with all things. So it's, so these are pre-existing categories that people like check the box if they'd had that experience. So, they're a little bit broad, a little bit general. They're not very Buddhist specific because they weren't designed for, the study of Buddhism in particular. So we also just asked people to describe in their own words what they meant when they checked those boxes. And then we got some more sort of like specifically Buddhist kinds of languaging, people talking about, remaining in a space without thoughts, or, being their experiences of non-self, the melting away of the self, overwhelming sense of love and wholeness and interconnectedness with everything. Things that are more sort of Buddhist in their language came out in the open-ended questions.
Career journeyers, are you looking to explore what is next in your professional adventure? Minding the Gap Coaching, a leadership and career coaching practice, is here to guide you to new perspectives and approaches about your professional journey. They will take you from where you are to where you want to be.
Yeah, so going back a little about, kind of like the traditional context for the study of Buddhism, or religion in general, why are scholars of religion reluctant to talk about their religious identities, and why is it so taboo?
Yeah, there's a interesting history with that in Western cultures, and I know the story a little bit more personally in North America, because that's where I live and have operated. But it has to do with the origins of our discipline, which, if you go back, 100+ years, the only place in the academy where religion was studied was in the in the theology department, right? And so, as the field of religious studies became disentangled from the field of theology, you could say, that the scholars who were interested in doing religious studies, perhaps, the pendulum swung like very far over to the other side, which is to say, it became taboo to speak about, your personal engagement with religion of any kind. So through, some of my colleagues who are older than me, in their 60s and 70s, retired colleagues as well, who are even older than that, will talk about, a time period where you really couldn't even mention that you were Buddhist or practicing Buddhism. If that became known, it would it would tarnish your reputation as a scholar, and you'd be like driven out of the field, right? So Charles Prebish is somebody who's published some articles, one article in Lions Roar, and also has written about this in some of his books. He's somebody who was, like he says, a closeted Buddhist, who eventually sort of like started to break that stigma, but slowly kind of over time being more outward with his Buddhist identity. But that really was only in the 1980s that sort of movement started to happen.
Right. I remember when I was in graduate school, so like going for a Buddhist, the Buddhist studies program, and I went in not as a practitioner. I was just interested in Buddhism, and then through the course of my study, I became interested in the tradition. I became to actually become a practitioner myself, and I remember, and that wasn't even that long ago, right? Like I remember just like not even telling my professors that now I was going to meditation, and like I had joined the Sangha, and like I was part of the rituals, and like I remember like not even mentioning any of that as I was like defending my thesis, because I was like, oh, I need to kind of like remain objective and like be perceived as an objective scholar, and not so like kind of like take away the subjectivity of it. So do you think this is shifting, and why or how is it shifting?
Yeah, I would say, so So, Chuck Prebish is writing about this in the 80s, being sort of like a more of a stigma. And then I do think more recently we have seen a shift sort of in the field where people who identify as Buddhist they're much more free to identify as Buddhist and to talk about the fact that they are Buddhist. You have quite a number of, like I said before, monastic scholars, of people who are monastics, but they have a position at a university and they're active in the field. And so I don't think there's a clear stigma associated with being Buddhist or practicing Buddhism. Although there seems to be an acceptance of certain kinds of Buddhist practices, but still a stigma of other kinds of Buddhist practices. So I have a colleague named Kin Chung who's spoken about how, he's a Chinese American, and he's spoken about how if he talks with his colleagues about having attended a meditation retreat, nobody bats an eyelid. But if he talks with his colleagues about how he grew up in his family doing ritual healing practices and working with spirits and energies and so on and so forth, then that actually sort of like still has a sort of a stigmatized that still is stigmatized within the field. So it's not even like all of Buddhism is welcome at the academy. It's really only certain kinds of practices and certain kinds of practitioners, of Buddhism. More of a sort of I guess more of like a rationalized kind of version of Buddhism is accepted, but things that are seen, maybe as being, ritualized and magical and so forth are not welcome. Yeah. So it's not like, yeah. So anyway, I think the point is that, the point is that people still today are, even if they're able to speak about their Buddhist identity and about participation in some parts of Buddhism, there's this whole arena that you're not able to talk about, which includes some of these kinds of like ritual practices and so forth, but then also includes like your personal experiences more generally. Like your first person experiences are not something that scholars talk about. So that was the point of this survey, is to try to discover some of that.
And how do you think kind of like their own personal involvement kind of influences their academic work?
Yeah, so I'm not Buddhist. Maybe I should have started by saying that. I recently have written a book called Buddhish, where I talk about, in much detail about how I'm not Buddhist, how I think that I think there are many very helpful practices and perspectives within the tradition, and then there's a lot that I don't buy into, that I don't think is very, very helpful. So maybe I should have started by sort of my own position.
But you are Buddhish.
Buddhist, yeah, Buddhist. So Buddhist, like kind of Buddhist, right? So yeah, as I do talk in the book about some of my own experience with practice, and some of my own experience with the kinds of phenomena or experiences that can arise through doing practice. So I do talk a little bit about my own experience, which is unusual for a scholar to do, but I do. And I have a new book that's coming out next year called A Lamp Unto Yourself, which is a sort of introduction to the practice of Asian spiritual traditions more generally beyond Buddhism. And in that book, I talk a lot about the kinds of first person subjective kind of experiences that can result from these practices. And there are a few other scholars. There's actually a branch of religious studies that studies mysticism, and in that arena, there's a little bit more tolerance and acceptance of first person narratives. The scholar Jeffrey Kripal is very instrumental in sort of that kind of conversation that's taking place. So there are some places where that kind of conversation can emerge, so in my own books that I'm writing, they're not academic books, they're popular books, the ones that I just mentioned, outward facing, public facing kinds of books. I have been more, I guess, more forthcoming than many of my colleagues. But still, it's not appropriate to put those into academic publications. So I don't, right? So for me, it's about kind of understanding the audience for different kinds of writing, and while you can have certain conversations in one venue, the other venues may not be the right setting for me to talk about those things. So so I don't. So I guess I'm sort of like somewhat participating in the in the this
So
by
in between space, like insider, outsider view, kind of, both kind of
yeah.
academic and kind of like one foot in like practice experiential, but not fully Buddhist. So yeah, it's an interesting place to be.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit like on the boundaries in a couple of different ways, but one thing that so I have been very transparent about being a practitioner of Asian medicine and Asian spiritual traditions, and I have been since the very beginning. But more recently, so I have a podcast. I don't know if it's okay to plug my podcast, but I have a podcast called Blue Beryl, Beryl, in which I interview scholars about their work, about their research. But the whole theme of the podcast for the last 2 years has been to also talking about their personal engagements with these practices, and hearing about their experiences and how central those experiences are for them, and how they do dovetail with their scholarship and influence their scholarship. So I've spent there's probably, I don't know, at this point, maybe at least 20 episodes with 20 different people, in the field, talking about these issues, and talking about, how different people have reconciled the split that we have to maintain between the academy and our personal lives, and then how we have navigated that ourselves. And anyway, the first episode, I talk about my own story, and then I interview a whole bunch of other people about the same topic. So people who are interested in sort of more detail can look there.
Sure. And I guess to close it out, what do you hope other scholars or institutions can take away from, the survey and your findings?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really turn this into like an advocacy moment. I just sort of was describing the situation, but yeah, I do think, I mean, the point that I've repeatedly made in the podcast, and that I would say, the takeaway point here, if we could draw a lesson from it and speak to the field, to the academy, it's really about, I think, about having, social, so it's fine to have social spaces where there's a certain kinds of norms and expectations. Like I don't think we want everybody just telling personal stories at academic conference when they're delivering their papers, right? That's probably not what we want that to look like. But overall, within the field, even at a conference, like when you're not giving the paper, but you're just kind of hanging out with your colleagues, having the space for people to be their full selves and to show up, as full human beings, I think is really important. And it's not just, mystical experiences or religious commitments that people can't talk about in those spaces. You really don't talk about, there's many things you don't talk about. You don't talk about, you don't talk about disability, you don't talk about, family life, you don't talk, there's a lot of things that are just sort of like, swept under the rug in academic spaces. And that, I think, is one of the missions of my podcast, and I think it could be a takeaway point here, is just about having these professional spaces be more tolerant and even welcoming of the full human being. I guess I would want to leave it on that note then.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and thank you for talking about this subject. It was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks again for the invitation. That was fun.
Thanks for listening. Mission-driven, nonprofit, and community-supported, Lion's Roar offers Buddhist teachings, news, and perspectives so that the understanding and practice of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom flourish in today's world. Go to lionsroar.com and subscribe to receive unlimited access to online articles, meditation instructions, our new Buddhist glossary, and so much more.